The morning mist clung to the valley like a whisper of secrets when Jake Morrison heard the sound that would change everything. It wasn't the usual symphony of his ranch awakening, no gentle lowing of cattle or the familiar creak of windmill blades catching the dawn breeze. This was different, urgent, the thunder of hooves against hard-packed earth accompanied by voices he didn't recognize. Jake set down his coffee mug on the porch rail and squinted through the gray light. Down the dirt road that led to his property, a cloud of dust rose like smoke signals. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As the sound grew closer, he could make out the silhouette of a horse and rider, but something was wrong with the picture. The horse moved with wild, uncontrolled energy, and there seemed to be more than one person clinging to its back. The black stallion burst through the morning haze like something from a fever dream. Its coat gleamed with sweat, eyes white-rimmed with panic or fury. Jake couldn't tell which. Foam flecked its mouth as it fought against the makeshift rope halter that served as its only restraint. But it was the riders that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. A woman sat astride the massive horse, her dark hair streaming behind her like a battle flag. Her arms encircled two small boys, twins by the look of them, maybe 4 or 5 years old. They clung to her with the desperation of children who had learned too young that the world could be dangerous. The woman's face was set in fierce concentration, every muscle in her body working to maintain control of both the stallion and her precious cargo. As Jake watched, transfixed, the stallion made a decision that nearly sent all 3 of its passengers tumbling to the ground. It reared up on its hind legs, front hooves pawing at the air like it was fighting invisible demons. The woman leaned forward, whispering something in its ear that Jake couldn't hear but somehow felt in his bones. Whatever she said, it worked. The horse settled back down, though its entire body remained coiled like a spring ready to explode. That was when the woman's eyes found Jake's across the distance. Even from 50 yards away, he could see the mixture of defiance and desperation in her gaze. She was running from something, that much was clear. The question was whether she was running toward salvation or simply delaying the inevitable. The stallion took the decision out of everyone's hands. It bolted straight toward Jake's ranch house, covering the remaining ground in seconds that felt like hours. Jake had just enough time to step back from the porch rail before the horse skidded to a halt in his front yard, sending gravel flying in all directions. For a moment, nobody moved. The stallion snorted and stamped, its sides heaving with exertion. The 2 boys stared at Jake with wide eyes that seemed too old for their faces. And the woman sat perfectly still, as if any sudden movement might shatter whatever spell had brought them safely to this moment. Jake cleared his throat. "That's quite an entrance," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of dealing with spooked animals and unexpected situations. "Though I have to say, most folks just knock." The woman's grip on the boys tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hoarse from what Jake suspected had been hours of talking the stallion through its panic. "We didn't mean to intrude. The horse just... he brought us here." Jake studied the trio more carefully now that they were close enough to see clearly. The woman was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her late 20s, with skin that spoke of time spent outdoors and hands that knew hard work. Her clothes were practical but worn, the kind of outfit someone wore when they needed to move fast and couldn't spare time for appearances. The boys were mirror images of each other, with sandy hair and serious expressions that made Jake's chest tight with recognition. He'd seen that look before, in his own mirror, in the years after his world had fallen apart. But it was the stallion that truly captured Jake's attention. The horse was magnificent, even in its current state of agitation. Coal black from nose to tail, with the kind of presence that demanded respect. Jake had been around horses his entire life, and he'd never seen anything quite like this one. There was intelligence in its eyes, but also something wild and untamed that suggested it had never known the gentle hand of a trainer. "He's not really ours," one of the boys piped up suddenly, his voice small but clear. "He found us sleeping by the river and wouldn't leave us alone." His brother nodded solemnly. "Mama says he's protecting us, but I think he's lost too." The woman, Mama, Jake noted, shot the boys a look that was equal parts pride and exasperation. "Boys, remember what we talked about. We don't share our business with strangers." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of the walls this woman had built around herself and her children. He'd built similar walls once, though his had been made of grief rather than whatever drove her to arrive at his ranch on the back of a wild horse. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said, taking a slow step forward. The stallion's ears flicked in his direction, but the horse didn't bolt. "This is my place, and I'm thinking you folks might could use some help." The woman hesitated, and Jake could practically see the internal war playing out behind her eyes. Trust versus caution. Need versus independence. Whatever had happened to bring her to this moment, it had taught her that accepting help came with a price. "I'm Sarah," she said finally. "These are my boys, Tommy and Tim." Jake nodded to each of them in turn. "Pleasure to meet you all, though I have to ask." He gestured toward the stallion, who was now eyeing Jake's water trough with obvious interest. "Where exactly did you find him?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "More like he found us. 3 days ago we were camping by Willow Creek, about 20 miles north of here. I woke up to find him standing over the boys like some kind of guardian angel. When we tried to leave, he followed. When we tried to shoo him away, he wouldn't budge. Finally, I figured the only safe thing to do was get on his back and see where he wanted to take us." "And he brought you here," Jake mused, studying the horse with new interest. There was something almost mystical about the idea of a wild stallion leading a woman and her children to safety. But Jake had learned long ago that the world held more mysteries than most people cared to acknowledge. Tommy, or maybe it was Tim, Jake couldn't tell them apart yet, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, I'm thirsty." Sarah's face immediately shifted into protective mode. "We should go," she said, starting to turn the horse. "We've bothered you enough." "Hold on there," Jake said, raising a hand. The stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and Jake could swear the horse was listening to every word. "When's the last time any of you had a proper meal? Or a safe place to rest?" Sarah's spine stiffened. "We're managing fine." Jake glanced pointedly at the boys, who were trying to hide their exhaustion but failing miserably. "I'm sure you are. But managing and thriving are two different things." He took another step closer, moving slowly and keeping his voice low and calm. The stallion watched him but didn't shy away. "I've got a barn that's cleaner than most hotels, a well that's never run dry, and a kitchen that's seen too little use since it's been just me here." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "And what would you want in return?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow, and he realized what assumptions she was making. What experiences had taught her to expect the worst from offers of help? His jaw tightened with anger, not at her, but at whatever had put that wariness in her voice. "Nothing," he said firmly. "Not a damn thing except maybe some company that doesn't moo or neigh." The boys giggled at that, the first genuine sound of happiness Jake had heard from them. Sarah looked down at her sons, and something in her expression softened. "The horse," she said after a long moment. "He's not trained. He's never been in a barn or around other animals. I don't know how he'll react." Jake studied the stallion, noting the way it had positioned itself to keep all potential threats in view while still maintaining contact with Sarah and the boys. "He seems pretty attached to you three. I'm thinking as long as you're comfortable, he'll settle down." As if to prove Jake's point, the stallion finally gave in to temptation and walked over to the water trough. He drank deeply, but Jake noticed that he kept one eye on the family the entire time. Whatever bond had formed between them over the past 3 days, it was strong enough to override the horse's natural wariness of humans. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that Jake could only guess at. Finally, she nodded. "1 night," she said. "We'll stay 1 night, and then we'll be on our way." Jake felt a mixture of relief and something else he wasn't ready to name. "Fair enough. Let's get you all settled." The next hour was a careful dance of logistics and trust building. Jake showed Sarah and the boys to the barn, which he'd converted years ago to include a small living space for hired hands who never seemed to stay long enough to use it. The quarters were simple but clean, with 2 narrow beds, a table and chairs, and a wash basin that Jake quickly filled with fresh water. The stallion presented a bigger challenge. He refused to be led anywhere Sarah wasn't, and he had strong opinions about the other horses in Jake's pasture. After 20 minutes of careful negotiation, they settled on giving him the large paddock closest to the barn, where he could see the family through the window while still having room to move. He doesn't like being closed in, Sarah explained as they watched the horse pace the perimeter of his temporary home. I think someone might have tried to break him once, and it didn't go well. Jake nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. He'd seen plenty of animals and people who carried the scars of someone else's attempts to control them. We'll leave the gate open then. If he wants to leave, he can. But I'm betting he'll stay close to you. Sarah gave him a look that was equal parts gratitude and suspicion. You're being awfully trusting with a stranger and her wild horse. Jake shrugged. Horse seems to have good judgment about people. Figure I'll trust his instincts. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake found himself cooking for 4 instead of 1 for the first time in years. It felt strange to have voices other than his own echoing through the kitchen, to set multiple plates on the table that had sat empty for so long. Tommy and Tim had overcome their initial shyness and were full of questions about the ranch, the animals, and everything else their curious minds could latch onto. Sarah remained more reserved, but Jake caught her smiling at her son's enthusiasm when she thought he wasn't looking. Do you have kids? Tim asked suddenly, his fork halfway to his mouth. The question hung in the air like smoke, and Jake felt Sarah's eyes on him as he searched for an answer. No, he said finally. No kids. It's just me here. Were you married? Tommy chimed in, apparently deciding that if one personal question was acceptable, more were welcome. Tommy, Sarah warned, but Jake held up a hand. It's okay. I was married, yes. My wife's name was Lisa. She died 4 years ago. The boys went quiet, their natural empathy kicking in even at their young age. Sarah's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry, she said simply. Jake nodded his thanks. What about you? The boy's father? Sarah's face immediately shuddered, and Jake realized he'd overstepped. Not in the picture, she said curtly, in a tone that made it clear the subject was closed. They finished dinner in relative quiet after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, they could hear the stallion moving around his paddock, occasionally whinnying softly as if checking on his human family. After the boys were settled in their beds, Jake and Sarah found themselves on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The stallion had positioned himself near the barn door where he could see them, his dark silhouette, a reassuring presence in the gathering dusk. He really did bring you here, Jake said, nodding toward the horse. I've lived on this land for 15 years, and I've never seen him before. Wild horses don't usually come this close to populated areas. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening was warm. I know it sounds crazy, but I think he was waiting for us. When I woke up that first morning and saw him standing there, it was like he was saying, it's time to go. Go where? Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Away from a man who thought he owned us. Away from a place where my boys were learning to flinch every time a door slammed. Away from a life that was slowly killing all of us. Jake felt that familiar anger rise in his chest again, the protective instinct that had never quite died even after he'd lost the people he'd once protected. He hurt you. It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't treat it like one. He hurt all of us, in different ways. The boys don't even remember what it feels like to be safe. They've spent the last 2 years walking on eggshells, trying to be invisible. Jake thought about the serious expressions on the twins' faces, the way they'd initially hidden behind their mother when he'd first spoken to them. How long have you been running? 6 months. We've been moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough for him to track us down. I've been working odd jobs, trying to save enough money to get us somewhere far away where we can start over. And the horse found you. Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving, a real smile that transformed her entire face. I was at the end of my rope, literally and figuratively. We'd been sleeping rough for 3 days because the last town we tried didn't work out. I was starting to think maybe he was right, maybe I couldn't take care of them on my own. But then this wild stallion decided to adopt your family. Something like that. The boys weren't even scared of him, which should have terrified me but somehow didn't. They just accepted that this massive, powerful creature wanted to protect them. Kids have better instincts about these things than adults do, I think. Jake glanced toward the barn where Tommy and Tim were presumably sleeping peacefully for the first time in who knew how long. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They seem like good kids. Resilient. They are. They're the reason I keep going when everything else falls apart. They deserve better than what they've had so far. They deserve better than running, too. Sarah's walls slammed back up so fast Jake could practically hear them. We're not running anymore. We're traveling. There's a difference. Jake held up his hands in surrender. Didn't mean anything by it. Just thinking out loud. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle settling in for the night, the distant call of an owl, the soft rustling of the stallion moving in his paddock. It was peaceful in a way that Jake had forgotten was possible when other people were involved. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Really?" Jake considered the question, knowing she deserved an honest answer. "Because 4 years ago, when Lisa was dying, strangers helped me in ways I'll never be able to repay. They didn't ask for anything in return, didn't expect gratitude or explanations. They just saw someone who needed help and provided it." He paused, remembering those dark days when his world had crumbled around him. "And because you remind me of something Lisa used to say, she believed that people came into your life when you needed them most, even if you didn't realize you needed them." Sarah turned to look at him, and in the starlight, her expression was unreadable. "You think we needed to find each other?" Jake thought about his empty house, his solitary meals, the way he'd been slowly turning into a ghost of himself over the past 4 years. "I think maybe we all did. You, me, the boys, even the horse." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the stallion whinnied softly from his paddock. Sarah stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, extending her hand toward the horse. To Jake's amazement, the stallion approached the fence and gently nuzzled her palm. "He's never done that with anyone else," Sarah said softly. "The boys can pet him, but only when I'm right there. He won't let strangers touch him at all." Jake joined her at the fence, moving slowly so as not to spook the horse. The stallion watched him with intelligent eyes, as if taking his measure. After a moment, the horse stepped closer and allowed Jake to stroke his neck. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake murmured. The stallion's coat was like silk under his fingers, and he could feel the power coiled in the animal's muscles. "He's magnificent." "He saved us," Sarah said simply. "I don't know how or why, but he saved us." As they stood there in the starlight, woman and man united in their wonder at the mysterious horse who had brought them together, Jake felt something shift inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart over the past 4 years didn't crumble all at once, but he felt the first hairline cracks beginning to form. Inside the barn, Tommy stirred in his sleep and reached out instinctively for his brother. Tim, even in dreams, shifted closer so their hands could touch. They had learned early that safety was found in connection, that they were stronger together than apart. Outside, the stallion kept his vigil, ears pricked for any sound that might threaten his adopted family. He had spent years running wild and free, answering to no one, belonging nowhere. But something about the woman and her cubs had called to him on a level deeper than instinct. He had found his purpose, and his purpose was protection. And on the porch, Sarah and Jake stood side by side, both of them damaged by life's cruelties, but beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible when you didn't have to face the darkness alone. The morning would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities for trust or retreat. But for now, in this moment suspended between yesterday's pain and tomorrow's possibilities, all of them, woman, man, children, and horse, had found something they hadn't even known they were looking for. They had found each other. The second day dawned gray and heavy, with clouds that promised rain by afternoon. Jake woke to the sound of voices outside his window and realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't the only one stirring with the sunrise. He pulled on his boots and headed toward the kitchen, drawn by the scent of coffee that he hadn't made himself. Sarah stood at his stove, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, stirring something in a large skillet. The boys sat at his kitchen table, their legs swinging as they shared what looked like his last box of cereal between them. The domestic scene hit Jake like a punch to the chest, bringing back memories of mornings with Lisa that he'd thought he'd successfully buried. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said without turning around. "The boys were hungry, and I found some eggs in your refrigerator." Jake cleared his throat, pushing down the unexpected wave of emotion. "Mind? Hell, I can't remember the last time someone cooked breakfast in this kitchen." Tommy looked up from his cereal. "Mama makes the best scrambled eggs. She puts cheese in them. And pepper," Tim added seriously. "But not too much pepper, because it makes your nose tickle." Jake poured himself coffee from the pot Sarah had made, noting that it was stronger than he usually drank it. "You folks sleep okay?" Sarah nodded, though Jake caught the dark circles under her eyes. "The boys slept through the night for the first time in weeks. I think they felt safe." What she didn't say, but Jake heard anyway, was that she hadn't slept much at all. He recognized the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned that letting their guard down could be dangerous, even in a place that felt safe. "The horse was restless around midnight," Jake mentioned casually, kept pacing the fence line, looking toward the road. Sarah's hand stilled on the spatula. "He does that sometimes. Like he's listening for something." Jake studied her profile, noting the way her shoulders had tensed. Something in particular he might be listening for? Before Sarah could answer, the stallion's sharp whinny cut through the morning air. It wasn't the soft greeting they'd heard the night before, but something urgent and warning. Sarah dropped the spatula and rushed to the window, the boys close behind her. "What is it, Mama?" Tommy asked, pressing his face against the glass. Sarah's face had gone pale. "I don't know, baby." "Jake, do you see anything?" Jake joined them at the window, his eyes scanning the horizon. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, a glint of metal caught his attention. A dark SUV was parked on the ridge that overlooked his property, too far away to make out details, but close enough to be watching. "Friend of yours?" Sarah's voice was tight with tension. Jake shook his head. "No one I know drives a vehicle like that. Most folks around here prefer trucks." The stallion paced frantically now, his head high and ears pinned back. Every line of his body spoke of a predator sensing danger, ready to fight or flee. Sarah watched the horse with the intensity of someone reading a language only she understood. "We need to go," she said suddenly, turning away from the window. "Boys, get your things. Now." "Mama, why?" Tim's voice was small and confused. "I thought we were staying." "Change of plans, sweetheart. We need to leave." Jake watched the family's practiced evacuation routine and realized this wasn't the first time they'd had to run at a moment's notice. Sarah moved with efficient desperation, gathering their few belongings while the boys automatically went to their assigned tasks. It was heartbreaking in its precision. "Hold on," Jake said, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "You don't know that car has anything to do with you." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Maybe not, but I can't take that chance. Not with the boys." Jake looked out the window again. The SUV hadn't moved, but something about its presence felt wrong. Patient, predatory. How would he have found you here? He has resources, money, connections. I knew it was only a matter of time. Sarah's hands shook as she stuffed clothes into a worn duffel bag. "I was stupid to think we could stay anywhere for more than a night." The boys had gone quiet, their earlier happiness replaced by the familiar tension of impending flight. Jake's heart clenched as he watched them transform from carefree children back into refugees, ready to run at their mother's command. "There's another way," Jake said quietly. Sarah paused in her packing. "What do you mean?" "I mean maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who—" She caught herself glancing at the boys. "You don't understand the situation." Jake moved closer, lowering his voice. Then help me understand. Because right now, I see a woman and 2 children who deserve better than spending their lives looking over their shoulders. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of an engine echoed across the valley. The SUV was moving, winding its way down the mountain road toward Jake's ranch. Sarah's face went white with terror. "It's him," she whispered. "Or someone working for him." Jake felt a cold fury settle in his chest. He'd seen that look of absolute terror before, in the eyes of animals that had been abused by humans who should have protected them. "Take the boys to the barn. Stay with the horse." "Jake, no. You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Maybe not, but I understand my property, and I understand unwelcome visitors." Jake's voice carried a steel that surprised even him. "Go to the barn, Sarah. Trust me." Sarah hesitated for a moment, torn between her instinct to run and her growing trust in this man who'd shown them nothing but kindness. Finally, she nodded. "Boys, we're going to see the horse. Grab your things." As Sarah and the twins hurried toward the barn, Jake stepped onto his front porch and settled into his rocking chair, coffee mug in hand. To anyone watching, he looked like a man enjoying his morning beverage, but his free hand rested on the rifle he'd propped against the porch rail. The SUV pulled into his driveway with the kind of aggressive confidence that immediately set Jake's teeth on edge. 2 men emerged from the vehicle, both wearing expensive suits that marked them as outsiders in this rural community. The driver was younger, probably hired muscle, but the passenger commanded attention. He was older, maybe 50, with the kind of cold eyes that Jake associated with men who enjoyed having power over others. "Morning," Jake called out, his voice friendly but his posture alert. "You fellows lost?" The older man approached the porch with the swagger of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I'm looking for my wife and children. I have reason to believe they might have come through here." Jake took a slow sip of his coffee. "That's so? What makes you think that?" "A witness saw them heading this direction. Woman with twin boys, traveling with a stolen horse." Jake's jaw tightened at the word stolen, but he kept his expression neutral. "Lot of families around these parts." "You got a description?" The man pulled out his phone and showed Jake a photo. It was Sarah, but a different Sarah than the one who'd cooked him breakfast that morning. This woman was perfectly groomed, wearing an expensive dress, smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked like a doll, beautiful but lifeless. "Pretty woman," Jake said, handing the phone back. "Haven't seen her, though." The man's eyes narrowed. "You're sure about that? Because interfering with a man's attempts to locate his family is a serious matter." Jake set his coffee mug down and stood up, his full height giving him a slight advantage over the visitor. "And trespassing on private property is also a serious matter, especially when you're making accusations about good folks." "Good folks?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That woman kidnapped my children and stole valuable property. She's mentally unstable, dangerous. If you're hiding her, you're putting those boys at risk." Jake felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury he'd experienced when he'd first understood what Sarah was running from. "Funny thing about unstable people," he said conversationally. "They don't usually inspire loyalty in wild animals. Takes a special kind of person to earn that kind of trust." The younger man shifted restlessly, his hand moving inside his jacket. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle, though he kept it out of sight behind his leg. "I'm going to ask you one more time," the older man said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Where is my family?" Jake met his gaze steadily. "And I'm going to tell you one more time. I haven't seen anyone matching that description." The tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap. From the barn came the sound of the stallion's agitated whinnying, and Jake prayed that Sarah was keeping the boys quiet and hidden. Finally, the older man stepped back. "This isn't over. I know they're in the area, and I will find them." "Good luck with that," Jake said, "but I'd suggest you do your searching somewhere else. Like I said, this is private property." The men returned to their SUV, but before getting in, the older man turned back to Jake. "When I find them, and I will, I'll remember who helped her run. That won't go well for you." Jake waited until the vehicle disappeared over the ridge before moving. Then he ran to the barn, his heart pounding with urgency. He found Sarah huddled in an empty stall with the boys, the stallion pacing anxiously outside the stall door like a guardian. "They're gone," Jake said, and Sarah's entire body sagged with relief. "For now," she whispered. But he meant what he said. "He'll be back." Jake studied her face, seeing the resignation there, the acceptance of a fate she believed was inevitable. "Tell me about him." Sarah looked at the boys, who were playing quietly with some old rope they'd found. Marcus Blackwood. Oil executive, multimillionaire, pillar of the community back in Texas. On paper, he's the perfect husband and father. And off paper, Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Off paper, he's a man who believes he owns everything he touches, including people. Jake thought about the cold calculation in Blackwood's eyes, the casual way he threatened violence. "How long were you married?" 5 years. I was young, naive, impressed by his money and attention. He was charming at first, attentive. By the time I realized what he really was, I was pregnant with the twins and completely isolated from everyone I'd ever known. What changed? What made you finally leave? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. He started looking at the boys the way he used to look at me, like they were possessions to be controlled rather than children to be loved. Tommy asked me why Daddy was always angry, and I realized I was raising them to accept that as normal. Jake felt his hands clench into fists. "So you ran." "I took nothing but the clothes on our backs and what little cash I could hide away. I knew he'd use his lawyers and his money to destroy me in court, so I had to disappear completely." "And the horse?" Sarah glanced toward the stallion, who had calmed somewhat but still watched the barn entrance vigilantly. "I think he's running from something too. Maybe he recognized kindred spirits." They spent the rest of the morning in a state of tense waiting, expecting the SUV to return at any moment. Jake found himself checking the windows constantly, his rifle never far from reach. The boys sensed the adults' anxiety and stayed close to their mother, their earlier playfulness replaced by watchful quiet. It was mid-afternoon when Jake made a decision that would change everything. "I'm driving into town," he announced. "There's someone I need to talk to." Sarah looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read to the boys. "Jake, if this is about us, please don't. I don't want you getting in trouble because of our problems. My trouble started the moment that man threatened me on my own property," Jake said firmly. "Besides, I'm not planning to get in trouble. I'm planning to prevent it." An hour later, Jake pulled up outside the office of Sheriff Rita Gonzalez, a woman he'd known since high school and trusted completely. Rita looked up from her paperwork as he entered, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "Jake Morrison. Don't see you in town much these days." "Rita, I need to talk to you about something. Something serious." Rita's expression sobered as she gestured for him to sit down. "What's going on?" Jake told her everything, from finding Sarah and the boys on the stallion's back to the morning's confrontation with Blackwood. Rita listened without interruption, taking notes and asking pointed questions about details. "You're sure about the name? Marcus Blackwood?" "Positive. Why?" Rita turned to her computer and typed rapidly. After a few minutes, she whistled low. "Jake, your instincts are spot on. This man has a history." She turned the monitor so Jake could see. Multiple restraining orders. Filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. 2 previous wives who died in accidents after attempting to leave him. A pattern of behavior that spoke of someone with enough money and influence to make problems disappear. "The problem is," Rita said, "officially Sarah Blackwood is wanted for kidnapping. He filed a report claiming she took the children and fled to avoid prosecution for drug charges." Jake's blood ran cold. "Drug charges?" "Cocaine possession with intent to distribute, supposedly found in her car during a routine traffic stop." Rita's expression was grim, but the timing is suspicious. Report was filed the day after she disappeared. "He set her up." "Probably, but proving it will be difficult. He's got money, lawyers, political connections. Sarah's just a woman on the run with no resources." Jake leaned forward. What if she wasn't on the run anymore? What if she stood and fought? Rita studied him carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking a man like Blackwood is used to people being afraid of him. Maybe it's time someone wasn't. Rita was quiet for a long moment. Jake, I've known you since we were kids. You're one of the good ones, always have been. But you're talking about going up against someone with serious power and no scruples. That's dangerous territory. More dangerous than letting him terrorize a woman and her children? Rita sighed. No, probably not. What do you need from me? Jake felt a surge of gratitude for his old friend. Information, legal options, and maybe some unofficial backup if things get complicated. I can work with that. But Jake, be careful. Men like Blackwood don't just accept defeat. If you're going to fight him, you better be prepared to win. Jake thought about Sarah's terror that morning, about the way the boys had automatically prepared to run, about the stallion's protective stance and the quiet desperation in Sarah's eyes. I'm prepared. On the drive back to the ranch, Jake's phone rang. Sarah's voice was tight with panic. Jake, you need to get back here. Now. What's wrong? The horse is going crazy. He won't calm down. And the boys are scared. I think someone's been here. Jake pressed harder on the accelerator. I'm 10 minutes out. Stay in the barn with the stallion. Don't let anyone separate you from him. Why? Because I think he's the best protection you've got right now. Jake arrived to find chaos. The stallion was rearing and striking at the fence, his calls echoing across the valley like war cries. Sarah and the boys huddled in the barn doorway, afraid to get too close to the agitated horse but unwilling to leave his protection. What happened? Jake demanded as he jumped out of his truck. I don't know. We were inside having lunch, and suddenly he started screaming like that. When I came out to check, I found this. Sarah handed him a piece of paper that had been nailed to the barn door. The message was simple and chilling. You can't hide forever. I'm coming for what's mine. Jake crumpled the paper in his fist, fury radiating through every fiber of his being. He was here, on my property. Jake, maybe we should just go. I don't want you getting hurt because of us. Jake looked at Sarah, really looked at her. He saw a woman who'd been strong enough to escape an impossible situation, brave enough to protect her children against overwhelming odds, and smart enough to recognize help when it came in the form of a wild horse. She deserved better than a life spent running. No, he said firmly. You're not going anywhere. But, Sarah, look at that horse. They all turned to watch the stallion, whose fury seemed to be directed not at them, but at some invisible threat. His entire body was coiled for battle, ready to defend his adopted family against any danger. He didn't choose you randomly, Jake continued. Animals have instincts about these things. He knew you needed protection, and he knew you were worth protecting. Well, so do I. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand what you're getting into. Maybe not, but I understand what I'm fighting for. That evening, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Jake sat on his porch with his rifle across his knees. Sarah and the boys were inside, the twins finally asleep after the day's terror. The stallion had calmed somewhat, but remained alert, patrolling the fence line like a sentry. Sarah emerged from the house with 2 cups of coffee, settling into the chair beside Jake. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the approaching thunder and watching lightning flicker in the distance. What did you find out in town? Sarah asked finally. Jake told her about his conversation with Rita, about Blackwood's history and the legal challenges they faced. Sarah listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each revelation. 2 other wives, she whispered when he finished. I always wondered what happened to his first wife. He said she died in an accident. Rita's going to help us build a case. It won't be easy, but it's possible. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Jake, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we fight him, there's no going back. He'll destroy anyone who stands against him. Jake thought about his empty house, his solitary life, the way he'd been slowly fading away until 3 strangers and a wild horse had crashed into his world. Maybe it's time someone stood against him. And if we lose? Jake reached over and took her hand. Then at least we'll have tried. And the boys will know that someone fought for them. Thunder rolled across the valley, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Inside the barn, the stallion whinnied softly, a sound of comfort rather than warning. The storm was coming, but they would face it together. As they sat on the porch, hands clasped and hearts united in purpose, none of them could have predicted how dramatically their lives would change in the coming days. They only knew that they'd found something worth fighting for, and they weren't going to let it go without a battle. The rain began in earnest, washing the dust from the air and promising renewal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had each other. And sometimes that was enough to begin with. 3 weeks had passed since Blackwood's visit, and the ranch had settled into a new rhythm. Sarah woke each morning to the sound of Jake feeding the cattle, her body no longer jolting awake at every unfamiliar noise. The boys had claimed the barn loft as their fortress, spending hours playing elaborate games with toy soldiers Jake had retrieved from his own childhood. The stallion grazed peacefully in the pasture, though his ears still swiveled constantly, alert for any sign of trouble. Sheriff Gonzalez had been busy during those weeks, quietly building a case with the help of contacts in Texas. Evidence was mounting that painted a clear picture of Marcus Blackwood's pattern of abuse and manipulation. 2 former employees had come forward with sworn statements about his violent temper. A private investigator had uncovered financial records showing payments to officials who'd helped cover up previous incidents. But Sarah knew that paper trails and witness statements might not be enough. Blackwood had survived accusations before, using his wealth and influence to make problems disappear. She watched Jake work around the ranch with growing anxiety, knowing that every day they stayed put them all in greater danger. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Tim didn't come down for breakfast. Sarah found him curled up in his bed, burning with fever and struggling to breathe. The local doctor confirmed her worst fears: pneumonia, serious enough to require immediate hospitalization. "I need to take him to Denver," Dr. Martinez explained. "The hospital here isn't equipped for pediatric respiratory cases this severe." Jake was already reaching for his truck keys. "I'll drive you." "No." Sarah's voice was sharp with panic. "If we go to a hospital, we'll have to use insurance. Give real names. He'll find us within hours." Jake studied her face, seeing the impossible choice she was being forced to make: save her son's life and expose them all to Blackwood's reach, or risk Tim's health to maintain their hiding place. "There's another way," Jake said quietly. "We register him under my name as my nephew. Pay cash. No insurance, no paper trail that leads back to you." Dr. Martinez frowned. "That's highly irregular. So is a man using private investigators to track down a woman and children who are running for their lives," Jake replied firmly. "Sometimes irregular is the only option that works." The drive to Denver felt endless. Tim lay across Sarah's lap in the back seat, his breathing shallow and labored. Tommy sat pressed against the window, his face pale with worry for his brother. The stallion had fought violently when they tried to leave him behind, finally breaking through the fence to follow the truck partway down the mountain road before Jake convinced him to return to the ranch. At the hospital, Jake's plan worked seamlessly. The staff asked few questions when he presented identification and signed the necessary forms. Tim was admitted under the name Timothy Morrison, and within hours he was receiving the aggressive treatment his condition required. Sarah barely left Tim's bedside for the next 3 days. Jake brought her coffee and forced her to eat, while Tommy alternated between sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair and exploring the pediatric ward with the boundless curiosity of a 5-year-old. On the second night, as Tim's fever finally began to break, Sarah found herself alone with Jake in the hospital corridor. "I can't keep doing this to them," she whispered, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "They deserve a normal life, with friends and school and birthday parties. Not hiding in barns and using fake names in hospitals." Jake leaned against the wall beside her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time to stop running and face whatever comes next." Before Jake could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. Sheriff Gonzalez had sent a single word: "Ready." The pieces had fallen into place faster than anyone had expected. A former employee of Blackwood's security company had provided surveillance footage showing Marcus entering Sarah's apartment the night she disappeared, planting the drugs that would later be discovered during the traffic stop. A forensic accountant had traced payments to the judge who'd issued the arrest warrant. Most damning of all, Blackwood's second wife's sister had finally found the courage to come forward with evidence that her sister's death hadn't been an accident. "We can end this," Jake told Sarah as they sat in Tim's hospital room watching both boys sleep peacefully. "Rita says the district attorney is ready to file charges." Federal charges, which means Blackwood's local connections won't help him. Sarah's hands trembled as she processed the information. What if it doesn't work? What if he finds a way to turn it around? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Sarah, you can't live the rest of your life afraid of what might happen. The boys can't grow up thinking that running is the only option when things get tough. The next morning, as they prepared to take Tim home from the hospital, Sarah made her decision. "Okay," she said simply. "Let's do it." The wheels of justice moved quickly once they were set in motion. Blackwood was arrested at his office in Dallas, charged with multiple felonies, including witness tampering, evidence planting, and conspiracy in the death of his second wife. The media attention was intense. Oil executive, society figure, pillar of the community, revealed as a domestic abuser and possible murderer. But Blackwood's reach extended further than anyone had anticipated. On the day he made bail, pending trial, private investigators descended on the small mountain town like locusts. They questioned locals, offered money for information, and made it clear that finding Sarah and the boys was their primary objective. Jake returned from town with groceries to find Sarah packing again, the boys sitting quietly on their beds while she stuffed clothes into the familiar duffel bag. "What are you doing?" "There are strangers asking questions about us all over town. It's not safe here anymore." Jake set down the groceries and gently took the bag from her hands. "Sarah, stop." "I can't. Don't you see? He'll never stop. Even from jail, he's still hunting us. Then we make sure he can't hunt anyone ever again." Jake's voice carried a determination that made Sarah look up from her packing. "What do you mean?" "I mean we give him what he wants. A face-to-face meeting where he can try to intimidate us into dropping the charges." Sarah's eyes widened in horror. "Jake, no. You don't understand what he's capable of. Actually, I think I do. But what he doesn't understand is what we're capable of when we fight together." The plan that emerged over the next several days was dangerous and dependent on perfect timing. Sheriff Gonzalez would arrange for Blackwood to believe he'd tracked Sarah to a remote cabin in the mountains. Federal agents would be positioned nearby, but not close enough to spook Blackwood into running. Jake, Sarah, and the boys would be there, wearing concealed recording devices that would capture whatever threats or admissions Blackwood might make. "This is insane," Sarah protested as they went over the details one final time. "You're asking me to use my children as bait." "I'm asking you to trust that we can protect them," Jake replied. "And trust that sometimes the only way to defeat a bully is to stand up to him." The stallion seemed to sense the approaching confrontation. In the days leading up to the planned meeting, he barely left the boys' side, following them around the ranch like a massive protective shadow. On the morning they were scheduled to leave for the cabin, the horse refused to let Tommy and Tim out of his sight, positioning himself between them and the truck. "He knows," Sarah said quietly, watching the stallion's agitated behavior. "He knows we're walking into danger." Jake studied the magnificent animal, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes and the way he seemed to be communicating something urgent. "What if we brought him with us?" "To the cabin?" "Jake, that's not part of the plan. Maybe it should be. Think about it. Blackwood believes he's dealing with a helpless woman and her children. He's not expecting a wild stallion who's already proven he'll fight to protect this family." Sheriff Gonzalez was skeptical when they modified the plan, but she agreed that the element of surprise might work in their favor. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, with multiple escape routes if things went wrong. The stallion could be positioned in the trees, close enough to respond, but hidden from immediate view. As they drove toward the mountains, the boys unusually quiet in the back seat, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a terrified woman fleeing into the night, with nothing but her children and the clothes on their backs. Now she was heading toward a confrontation that would determine their future, supported by a man who'd become family, and protected by a horse who'd chosen them for reasons she still didn't fully understand. The cabin was exactly as Sheriff Gonzalez had described: isolated, defensible, with good sightlines in all directions. Jake and Sarah worked quickly to position the recording equipment while the boys explored their temporary refuge. The stallion grazed in a nearby meadow, but his attention remained focused on the clearing where the cabin sat. At exactly 3 o'clock, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed through the forest. Blackwood arrived with a small convoy, 2 SUVs carrying what appeared to be private security personnel. Sarah's hands shook as she watched her former husband emerge from the lead vehicle, his expensive suit and confident swagger unchanged despite his recent arrest. "Remember," Jake murmured, "we need him to talk. The more he says, the stronger the case becomes." Marcus Blackwood approached the cabin with the arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way. His security team spread out around the clearing, professional and alert. But none of them had noticed the dark shape moving through the trees at the forest's edge. "Sarah," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I know you're in there. Time to stop this foolishness and come home." Sarah stepped onto the cabin's small porch, Jake beside her, the boys visible through the open doorway behind them. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, clearly not expecting to find Sarah flanked by a protector. "Hello, Marcus." "Who's this?" Blackwood nodded toward Jake, his tone dismissive. "Someone who believes children shouldn't have to live in fear of their own father." Blackwood's laugh was cold and calculating. "Father? Those boys belong to me. Just like you do. Did you really think you could hide forever?" "I wasn't hiding," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was protecting them from you." "Protecting them?" Blackwood's voice rose with practiced indignation. "By dragging them around the country like refugees? By making them accomplices to theft and kidnapping? The only thing I stole was their chance to grow up without fear." Blackwood took a step closer, his mask of civility beginning to slip. "You think this man can protect you? You think the law will side with a disturbed woman who kidnapped her own children?" "I think the law will side with evidence," Jake interjected, "like the video footage of you planting drugs in Sarah's car." Blackwood's face darkened with rage. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, cowboy. I have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers who will destroy you in court. Investigators who will dig up every mistake you've ever made. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Cross me, and I'll make sure you lose everything. Your ranch, your reputation, your freedom. I'll make you disappear just like—" Blackwood caught himself, but it was too late. The words hung in the air like an admission of guilt. "Just like your other wives?" Sarah finished quietly. The rage that crossed Blackwood's face was terrifying in its intensity. He lunged toward the porch, his security team moving to flank him. But before anyone could reach the cabin steps, a sound erupted from the forest that froze everyone in place. The stallion's war cry echoed off the mountains as he burst from the tree line at a full gallop, his massive body moving with lethal grace and purpose. Blackwood's security team scrambled for their weapons, but the horse was already among them, rearing and striking with hooves that could shatter bones. In the chaos that followed, Sheriff Gonzalez and her federal backup emerged from their concealed positions. Blackwood found himself surrounded, his security team neutralized, his threats and admissions captured on multiple recording devices. "Marcus Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy, witness intimidation, and violation of federal custody orders." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Blackwood's eyes found Sarah's across the clearing. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll find a way to make you pay." The stallion stepped between them, his massive head lowered, and ears pinned back in unmistakable warning. Whatever fight Blackwood had left drained out of him as he faced the horse's protective fury. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of Jake's ranch house, watching through the window as Tommy and Tim played in the yard with their new puppy. The stallion grazed peacefully nearby, no longer a guardian against immediate threat, but a beloved member of the family who'd chosen them. Marcus Blackwood was serving a 25-year sentence in federal prison, his appeals exhausted and his empire crumbled. The boys had started school in town, making friends and learning to live without fear. Sarah had legally reclaimed her maiden name and filed for divorce, finally free to build the life she'd dreamed of during those long months of running. Jake emerged from the barn, hay in his hair and a smile on his face that had become as familiar as sunrise. "The lawyer called," he said, wrapping his arms around Sarah from behind. "The adoption papers are finalized. Tommy and Tim are officially Morrisons now." Sarah leaned back against his chest, watching their boys play in the golden afternoon light. "Think they'll remember any of this when they're older? They'll remember that when things got scary, people who loved them fought to keep them safe. They'll remember that sometimes help comes in unexpected forms, like wild horses and strangers who become family." Outside, the stallion lifted his head from grazing and looked toward the house, as if sensing their conversation. His eyes held the wisdom of a creature who understood that some bonds were forged in crisis and strengthened by choice. "What do you think he'll do now?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the horse. "Now that we don't need protecting anymore?" Jake smiled, thinking about the mare he'd been planning to introduce to the pasture, about the possibility of foals running wild and free on his land. "I think he'll do what we're all doing. Start building something new." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, the Morrison family settled into their evening routine. The boys helped with chores, Sarah cooked dinner, and Jake checked on the animals. The stallion kept watch from the pasture, no longer guardian angel but beloved family member. They had found each other in desperation and chosen each other in love. And sometimes, that was exactly how the best families were made. 2 years had transformed the Morrison Ranch into something entirely different from the quiet, solitary place Jake had inhabited for so long. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the valley every morning, mixing with the gentle whickering of horses and the contented lowing of cattle. Where once there had been silence and memories, now there was life in its fullest, most chaotic form. Sarah stepped onto the front porch with her morning coffee, a ritual that had become sacred to her. The sun was just cresting the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, she could see Jake working with a young colt in the training pen, his movements patient and sure. The sight never failed to make her heart skip, even after all this time. Tommy and Tim, now 7 years old and growing like weeds, were supposed to be getting ready for school. Instead, they were in the barn loft, engaged in what sounded like an epic battle between good and evil. Complete with sound effects that could probably be heard in the next county, Sarah smiled into her coffee cup. Some things never changed. The stallion, who the boys had eventually named Thunder despite his generally peaceful demeanor, grazed in the far pasture with his small herd. Jake had been right about introducing the mare. Thunder had taken to fatherhood with the same protective intensity he'd shown toward the boys, and now 3 foals roamed the property under his watchful eye. The sight of the black stallion teaching his offspring to run and play was one of Sarah's greatest joys. "Boys," Sarah called toward the barn, "school starts in an hour!" A chorus of groans emerged from the loft, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps and whispered negotiations. Sarah shook her head, remembering a time when getting the twins ready meant grabbing whatever few possessions they had and running. Now it meant negotiations over which toys could come to school and whether wearing mismatched socks was a fashion statement or a cry for help. Jake emerged from the training pen, dust on his jeans and satisfaction on his face. The young horse he'd been working with had finally accepted the bridle without a fight, a breakthrough that had been weeks in the making. He spotted Sarah on the porch and waved, that easy smile that had become her anchor spreading across his weathered features. "How's our student today?" Jake asked as he approached the house, nodding toward the pen where the colt now stood calmly. "Better. He's starting to trust that the bit won't hurt him." Jake settled onto the porch step beside Sarah's chair. "Funny how much patience it takes to convince someone that you're not going to hurt them." Sarah reached down and ran her fingers through his hair, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Some of us are worth the wait." Jake caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "All of us are." The peaceful moment was interrupted by a crash from inside the house, followed by Tommy's voice declaring, "It wasn't me!" and Tim's immediate response of, "It wasn't me either." Sarah and Jake exchanged a look that held years of shared parenting experience. "Kitchen?" Jake guessed. "Definitely kitchen," Sarah confirmed. They found the twins standing over the remains of what had once been Sarah's favorite mixing bowl, their faces wearing identical expressions of innocent confusion. Cereal was scattered across the floor like confetti, and somehow Tim had managed to get milk in his hair. "We were making breakfast," Tommy explained helpfully. "For the horses." "Horses don't eat cereal," Sarah pointed out, trying to keep her voice stern despite the urge to laugh. "We know that now," Tim said solemnly. Jake grabbed the broom while Sarah surveyed the damage. "New rule," she announced. "Horse breakfast happens in the barn, people breakfast happens in the kitchen, and never the two shall meet." "What about when Thunder comes to visit?" Tommy asked, referencing the stallion's occasional habit of sticking his head through the kitchen window to investigate interesting smells. "Thunder gets invited breakfast, not made breakfast," Jake clarified, already sweeping up cereal. "There's a difference." 20 minutes later, the twins were clean, fed, and loaded into Jake's truck for the ride to school. Sarah waved from the porch as they drove away. Tommy and Tim pressed against the back window, making faces at her until the truck disappeared around the bend. The silence that followed wasn't the empty quiet of her old life, but the peaceful pause of a busy household catching its breath. Sarah finished her coffee and headed toward the barn, where the morning chores waited. Thunder lifted his head as she approached, his dark eyes bright with intelligence and affection. "Morning, beautiful," she murmured, offering him the apple she'd brought from the kitchen. "Ready for another day of keeping everyone in line?" Thunder accepted the apple with his usual dignity, then gently nudged her shoulder in the way that meant he wanted attention. Sarah obliged, running her hands over his sleek neck and marveling, as she did every day, at the chain of events that had brought them all together. The sound of an unfamiliar vehicle approaching made Thunder's ears prick forward, though he didn't show the alarm that would have indicated real danger. Sarah looked toward the road and saw a silver sedan making its way up the drive. Visitors weren't uncommon these days, but they were still noteworthy enough to warrant investigation. The car stopped near the house, and a woman emerged from the driver's side. She was perhaps 40, professionally dressed, with the purposeful air of someone on official business. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, a remnant from the days when unexpected visitors meant danger. "Mrs. Morrison?" the woman called, approaching with a folder in her hand. "Yes? I'm Jennifer Walsh from the State Adoption Services. I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit, but I was in the area and wanted to check on how things are going." Sarah relaxed immediately. Jennifer had been their caseworker during the adoption process, a kind and thorough professional who'd helped guide them through the legal maze of making the boys officially part of the Morrison family. "Of course, Jake's taking the boys to school, but he should be back soon. Would you like some coffee?" They settled on the front porch, and Sarah found herself telling Jennifer about the boys' progress in school, their growing confidence, the way they'd begun to talk about their future, without the shadow of fear that had once colored their every plan. "They're remarkable children," Jennifer observed. "The transformation from our first meeting to now is extraordinary." Sarah thought back to that first meeting, when Tommy and Tim had hidden behind her chair and refused to speak to anyone but each other. Now they were student council representatives, soccer players, and self-appointed junior ranch hands who took their responsibilities seriously. "It's amazing what safety can do for a child," Sarah said. "When they don't have to spend their energy being afraid, they can use it to grow instead." Jake's truck rumbled up the drive, and Sarah watched her husband's face shift from mild curiosity to genuine pleasure when he recognized their visitor. The boys tumbled out of the truck and raced toward the porch, their backpacks forgotten in their excitement. "Miss Jennifer," Tommy called, launching himself into her arms for a hug that spoke of real affection. "Are you here to check on us?" Tim asked, settling onto the porch step beside her chair. "Because we're doing really good. Want to see our report cards?" Jennifer laughed, accepting the crumpled papers that Tim produced from his backpack with the solemnity of someone receiving state documents. "Excellent grades, both of you. Your parents must be very proud." "Jake's teaching us to ride," Tommy said, settling in for what Sarah recognized as a comprehensive update on their lives. "And Mama's teaching us to cook things that don't fall on the floor." "Usually," Tim added helpfully. Jake joined them on the porch, acceptance and contentment radiating from his relaxed posture. "How are things at the office, Jennifer?" "Busy as always." But visits like this make it all worthwhile. She gestured toward the boys, who were now engaged in an animated discussion about whether Thunder was smart enough to learn tricks. Successful placements like yours remind me why I do this job. They spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of people who'd shared difficult times and come through stronger. Jennifer admired the horses, listened to elaborate explanations of barn cat politics, and accepted a tour of the vegetable garden that the boys had claimed as their personal domain. As she prepared to leave, Jennifer pulled Sarah aside. I wanted you to know that Marcus Blackwood's parole hearing was denied again last week. His appeals are exhausted, and he'll serve his full sentence. You don't have to worry about him anymore. Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying lift from her shoulders. Thank you for telling me. You've built something beautiful here, Jennifer said, looking around the ranch with obvious approval. The boys are thriving, you and Jake are clearly happy, and that horse of yours seems to think he's running his own protection service. Sarah laughed, watching Thunder patrol the fence line with his usual vigilance. He takes his job seriously. Good for him. Everyone should have something they feel responsible for protecting. After Jennifer left, Sarah found herself walking toward the pasture where Thunder and his herd grazed peacefully. The stallion approached when he saw her coming, as he always did, offering his presence as comfort and support. She's right, you know, Sarah told him, scratching behind his ears in the spot that made him close his eyes in contentment. You do run your own protection service. The question is, what are you protecting us from now? Thunder opened his eyes and looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his thinking face. Then he turned toward the house, where Jake was helping the boys with homework at the kitchen table, and Sarah understood. He wasn't protecting them from external threats anymore. He was protecting their happiness, their peace, their right to be a normal family with normal problems like spilled cereal and forgotten backpacks. He was standing guard over their joy. That evening, after dinner and homework, and the elaborate bedtime ritual that involved at least 3 stories and negotiations over whether dinosaur pajamas were appropriate for a Tuesday, Sarah and Jake found themselves alone on the front porch. It was their time, this quiet hour when the day settled into memory, and tomorrow was still just possibility. Jennifer said Blackwood's parole was denied again, Sarah mentioned, settling into the chair that had become hers by unspoken agreement. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. How do you feel about that? Sarah considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, news about Marcus would have sent her into a spiral of anxiety in preparation for flight. Now it felt like information about a storm that had passed, relevant but no longer threatening. Relieved, she said finally, but also grateful that it doesn't control my life anymore. He's just a man in prison now, not the monster in my nightmares. That's growth. That's therapy, Sarah corrected with a smile. And time. And safety. And you. Jake reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. You did the hard work. I just held the space for you to do it. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle settling in for the evening, the distant call of an owl, the soft sounds of horses moving in the pasture. Somewhere in the house, one of the boys was talking in his sleep, a murmur of words too soft to understand but comforting in their normalcy. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Thunder hadn't found us that night? Sarah asked. Jake considered the question. Sometimes. But then I remember what you told me about painting doors and windows, and I think maybe he didn't find you. Maybe you found each other. Sarah smiled, remembering her long-ago explanation about painting things that didn't lock her in. You think Thunder was looking for a way out too? I think he was looking for a purpose. Same as all of us, really. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of Thunder moving closer to the fence nearest the house. Even in the darkness, Sarah could make out his familiar silhouette, positioned where he could see both the pasture and the family he'd chosen to protect. Jake, do you think we should have more children? The question surprised them both. Sarah hadn't planned to ask it, and Jake's sharp intake of breath suggested he hadn't expected to hear it. But now that the words were in the air between them, they felt right. Do you want more children? Jake asked carefully. Sarah thought about Tommy and Tim, about the joy they'd brought to her life, and the way they'd transformed Jake from a solitary man into a devoted father. She thought about the spare bedrooms in the house, about Thunder's protective instincts, and the way Jake's face lit up when he watched the twins learn something new. "I want our children," she said. "Whatever form they come in. Biological, adopted, fostered. I want our family to be big enough to hold all the love we have to give." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if she'd overstepped, assumed too much about their shared future. Then he stood up and pulled her into his arms, holding her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes to all of it." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot on the front porch, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her growing belly. The pregnancy had been a surprise, coming sooner than they'd planned, but welcome beyond measure. Tommy and Tim had appointed themselves her personal bodyguards, insisting on carrying everything heavier than a coffee cup and offering daily updates on the baby's development based on their extensive research. Thunder had become even more protective, if such a thing were possible. He'd taken to standing guard outside the house during Sarah's afternoon rest periods, and Jake swore the horse had developed the ability to sense her moods before she did. "He knows," Tommy had declared after Thunder had appeared at the kitchen window during a particularly emotional day. "He can tell when Mama needs horse hugs." The adoption paperwork for their newest addition was already in progress. A 3-year-old girl named Lucy, whose mother had died in an accident and whose father was unknown. She would arrive the following month, another child who needed the safety and love that the Morrison family had learned to provide. Sarah smiled, thinking about the way their lives had expanded to accommodate each new blessing. The house rang with laughter and argument and the organized chaos of a growing family. The barn held not just Thunder and his offspring, but a pony that Jake was training specifically for small riders, and a collection of cats who'd appointed themselves official greeters for all visitors. Jake emerged from the barn, his step quickening when he saw her on the porch. Even after all this time, he still looked at her like she was a miracle he couldn't quite believe was real. "How are my girls today?" he asked, placing his hands gently on her belly. "Your daughter is practicing her soccer kicks," Sarah said, laughing as the baby responded to Jake's voice with a particularly enthusiastic movement. "I think she's going to be athletic like her brothers. Or stubborn like her mother. Definitely stubborn like her mother." They stood together in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the life they'd built from fragments of broken dreams and unexpected chances. In the pasture, Thunder watched over his herd with the same devotion he'd shown their human family. The stallion had found his purpose in protection, and in protecting them he'd saved himself. Tommy and Tim would be home from school soon, full of stories and questions and plans for the weekend. Lucy would arrive with her own fears and hopes, ready to be folded into the fabric of their family. The baby would come in the spring, another Morrison to love and protect and guide toward their own dreams. It wasn't the life Sarah had imagined when she'd fled into the night with nothing but her children and terror for companions. It was better. It was built on choice rather than desperation, on love rather than fear, on the understanding that families came in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes included wild horses who knew exactly where they belonged. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of promise and possibility, Sarah Morrison stood in the doorway of her home and counted her blessings. They were too numerous to name, too precious to measure, and too firmly rooted to ever be lost again. In the distance, Thunder lifted his head and whinnied softly, a sound of contentment that echoed across the valley like a benediction. He had brought them together, this unlikely family, and now he would spend his life making sure they stayed that way. Some guardians wore badges or uniforms. Some carried weapons or authority. But the best guardian of all was a wild stallion who'd looked at a desperate woman and her children and decided they were worth saving. And in saving them, he'd saved himself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.